My name is Kaya Cholka, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe webinar platform. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handout pods directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a session where presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. Finally, this will be archived approximately 2 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also check out past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Melissa Hanson from Fox Valley Technical College to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Kaya, for that introduction. As Kaya mentioned, my name is Melissa Hanson, and I am the Region 2 Liaison with the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. The Amber Alert TTA program has partnered with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center to host this webinar as part of our Amber Alert in Indian Country webinar series. In conjunction with our mission, this series works to effectively address the needs of victims and increase collaboration between state, local, and tribal communities in response to the exploitation of children and other forms of child victimization. To learn more about the Amber Alert in Indian Country initiative and to view past webinars, please visit us at our website, www.ncjpc.org/AmberAlert. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to submit your questions via the Q&A box located on your screen, as we will answer these throughout the presentation. And without further ado, I would like to introduce and turn today's presentation over to our presenter and subject matter expert, Melissa Riley, owner of Native Community Development Associates. Melissa?
Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that introduction, and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're located around the country. My name is Melissa Riley, and I am located about 50 miles west of Albuquerque on the Pueblo of Laguna Reservation, but I'm originally from the Mescalero Apache tribe, and I have been working in the child welfare juvenile justice system for too many years that I care to name right now. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. Last webinar, I think, was a really good, we had a lot of good questions, and I'm very thankful for OJJDP and for Fox Valley Technical College and allowing me to share some information with everyone. So starting off, today's webinar, Interviewing Strategies with Native American Children and Their Families. Just an introduction to what I'll be presenting is that today's webinar is intended to really provide you with some ideas on techniques or strategies for interviewing Native American families and children. Sometime throughout the interview or the webinar, we'll be talking about some of the questions or asking questions to each of you. And I just want everybody to be very clear that, you know, when we talk about interviewing strategies, it doesn't necessarily mean a forensic interview approach, but more or less, you know, ways that we need to modify our approaches in getting information from children and families, and in such a way that demonstrates cultural competency and actually puts cultural competent approaches into action. Approaches that I'll be sharing today are really my own, and I use these techniques as a foundation that's been based on experience, research, and observation as I've worked with a number of tribes throughout the country, and also as an instructor at New Mexico State University here in New Mexico. So our learning objectives are located here. And today I hope that, with all of these objectives identified, that you take away the ideas of the importance of specific interviewing strategies for Native American families and children, and also some additional considerations of the questions that I think a lot of times our social workers, family advocates, or law enforcement are hesitant to ask, but I think overall our gut instinct to elaborate questions and to kind of make them or bring them out in a way that's understood is really more important. I always think about quality versus quantity, and we do want quality questions as we work with children and families, because that's really what's going to help us determine next steps for children and their families. So the major points of the presentation that I'll be covering are listed here on this slide, which is the inception of the report, which is where we begin jumping into action when something happens in our community, and also the preparation for interview, approaches, and outcomes. So we have a poll question. Have you completed forensic interview training? And I'll let Melissa upload that question. So if I could get everyone to take just a moment to respond to that, that would be most helpful. I want to see who I have here on the call today.
I think that we've received our response, so Melissa, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. All right, and we're back online. Okay, can we see those results? Okay, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. So let's start with the inception of the report. That's really, like I said, where everything begins. We have a report that comes in. We have a response time and responsibility, and really lining up what we're going to do. And this diagram that I have here on this slide is just really a visual to give you an idea of all the processes or steps that we go through. Receiving the report, doing the screening and intake, investigation, determination, and then next steps or referrals. Where are we going to refer children and families to in this process? So this is how I visualize it in the work that I do. Now, the purpose of an interview And I know that this might sound a little generic, a little, beginner 101 type thing, but it's really important to put this into perspective because not all of our tribal workers have gone to school. A lot of them are self-taught, and I'll tell you that some of those self-taught, have been in the program or in the field for 20 plus years are really the ones that have a really unique base of knowledge that I think we can all learn from. And whenever I work or train or interact with social workers coming fresh out of school or mental health counselors that are coming fresh out of school or from internships, sometimes everyone has a different idea of why we're doing the interviews. But I think it's, these are the basic tenets of that, which are to establish contact, gather information, assess child safety and needs, and also look at the dynamics and relationships of the family. Sometimes we might have workers or initial interviewers that are not law enforcement that kind of look at the purpose of interviewing as a way to find faults or to see who is, guilty of something or, and that's really not our purpose. And sometimes I like to really ground it back down in working with folks to help them understand that we have a specific purpose of interviews, and the outcomes of those interviews will determine our next actions. So assessment versus investigation. There is a difference. There is a difference, and I know some of my law enforcement or social work colleagues may differ with me, and that's fine. But assessment is really the act of making a judgment about something. You get material, as you'll see on the CAN report, which is one of your handouts there at the top of the screen. I hope everyone was able to download that. But assessment, once you get a report, whether it's a written report or a phone call intake and you're collecting all the information, it's a lot of what I would like to think is a critical thinking process. Okay, we're trying to find out the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and we're going to assess that information because that's really what helps us determine the best approach that we're going to use for potential interviews or an interview. An investigation is about finding out the facts. So we use that assessment technique of looking at all the information we have and what's missing, what's there, finding the gaps, and then we go into investigation mode where we're trying to really put what our assessments are into action. Oftentimes I hear assessment and investigation used interchangeably, but I've gone through forensic interview training, as recent as 5 years ago. And one of the things that I think some audience or participants understand is that in order for us to be more effective as what we're doing in communication, we need to figure out where the assessment starts and where the investigation will proceed after that. So we have another poll question. How many of you are law enforcement and use forensic interview techniques on a regular basis?
Melissa, it looks like 95% of our audience is not a member of law enforcement that uses forensic interviewing techniques on a regular basis.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. All right. Thank you. So our next question is, are you a social worker who uses forensic interviewing techniques on a regular basis?
And once again, Melissa, with this one, it looks like about 80% are not a social worker that uses forensic interviewing techniques on a regular basis.
Okay.
So very similar.
All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for those responses. The questions that I'm asking are more along the lines, as I said, to really get a feel for the audience that I'm speaking with today. You know, really, quite frankly, I've been, as I was working in the field of child welfare and in behavioral health, I really didn't take the forensic interview training until years after I was on the job. But to be quite honest, you know, it was really just going through the forensic interview training and it validating some of the approaches I was already using, but it provided that certification that if need be, and because I'm located in a rural area, I could be the person to facilitate that forensic interview. So, you know, if you don't have that formal training or the certification process in place, you know, it's something to consider. But if what you're using works and you work well with your U.S. Attorney's Office, law enforcement, prosecutor, and so forth, then you know, the only thing you can do is enhance those types of skills. He covered this, and really its assessment comes first all the time, every time, and then the investigation second. So here's just a conceptual map of what this process looks like. We assess information, we investigate, we assess the information retrieved from the investigation, and then we move forward with next steps, whether it's prosecution or invalidating the report as abuse or neglect. So at this portion of the webinar, I believe we're going to take one or two questions.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you just a few questions that we received so far. And so I know you're out in New Mexico, but we did have one question about some folks that are out of Arizona, and if you have any recommendations on where they might be able to obtain forensic interviewing training, or maybe if there's like a national organization that you could recommend.
So one of the national organizations that really could help in identifying a training to fit your needs is the National Children's Alliance. And they have connections. They actually provide the certification to organizations to provide that type of training. The training, one that I went through with the agency was in Minnesota. That was First Witness. I saw we have some folks on the webinar from Minnesota, so they might be familiar with that organization. And the person that provided the training at that time was a child abuse investigator for the Minnesota Police Department. So I think if you go on to the National Children's Alliance website, you would be able to find some resources, and they're at www.nationalchildren'salliance.org. Melissa, is there anything else?
Well, I think you're going to get into this later in your presentation, but another question is based on kind of your experience and what you're seeing during that assessment phase, how can social workers and law enforcement best collaborate when working in Indian country? But I think that might be something you'll be able to answer as we move forward.
Well, I'd be happy to take that question now.
Okay. Yep.
As we go into, as we're talking right now about the inception of the report, now we're preparing for the interview. But as always, even for New Mexico, who is a non-PL280 state, we work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and our tribal police department. So it's really important at the inception of the report that once that report is received, part of VA protocol, as they've so graciously defined for us in their handbook, is that we cross-report. So that collaboration is not only mandated, but it's also necessary and good practice to once we get that report, we call the intake line or we fax it to these agencies, and we let them know, hey, we've got this report. Ideally, and some of the issues that I've had in the past is that oftentimes tribal social services or behavioral health or whoever the agency is might get the report first, and sometimes they screen them out based on their own rating system, and then it's kind of a dropped ball because what happens is we oftentimes, in my own experience I'm speaking from, is that sometimes if another report surfaces but it's to another agency, or maybe the school counselor calls law enforcement and they say, well, we reported this, how many weeks or months ago and social services didn't do anything, then that tends to create conflict among the agencies within that community. So cross-reporting is always recommended at the inception of a report.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have a few other Q&A sessions throughout the webinar, so I encourage participants to continue to submit your questions. But Melissa, you can continue.
All right, thank you. All right, so preparation for the interview. Basic questions: where, when, how many, and how long. Interview locations are dependent on the following: the incident, age of the child, safety, and technology. And identify those four components when identifying a location, because there's some really important factors to consider when you're preparing to conduct an interview. Oftentimes, if we are in a rural area and something significant has happened, a child has been sexually abused, or physically, another physical harm has been committed against them, time is always of the essence because we need to collect that evidence. So I think first and foremost, knowing where our emergency locations are to conduct an interview is always important, especially establishing in a program policies and procedures. However, in instances of neglect, a physical abuse that didn't result in great bodily harm, then we're looking at other areas such as maybe the local social services office, somewhere where we are not perpetuating emotional and more emotional harm to the child and to the non-offending parent or caregiver. In some communities I know of in Arizona and I believe in Alaska, some of our communities have offered to train community members to establish their homes as a safe home, where an exam or an interview of some type can take place there. It's a homely feel, it's a natural feel, it's something that's easily accessible and that providers can access at any time of the day. And the reason why I bring that up and why I think it's so important is because if you're in a community I used to be the CJ, or Children's Justice Act Partnership TA provider, and one of my grantees was a tribal community out in South Dakota. And at times, when an incident occurred, the children or even other victims of crime would have to travel anywhere from an hour to 2 hours to a forensic interview site where not only the interview would take place, but also a medical exam. And when you think about the time on the road and the time for a victim to reflect and determine whether they want to recant about an incident, those are things that we need to take into consideration. And I say this also with some data behind it, and or some interpretation of data, I should say, is that we have a high number of cases that are reported, like I mentioned in our last webinar, where we had over 3 million reports of child abuse that occur in this country every year. But a lower number of that actually gets to the prosecution level. And when you think about those victims that are in rural areas and tribal communities, and they have to commute to the next big city or big town to get these interviews over with, that's a lot of thinking time. So when we think about the comparison of cases that actually go through the prosecution process versus the high number of reports that occur, we have to really take into consideration how quickly we're responding and what our resources are within those communities. Also, safety and technology. I mentioned about the safe houses and ensuring that those types of local resources are actually safe, and that we do have the technology, whether it's cameras, recorders, internet, and those types of things readily available to us to help ensure that we're collecting all of the information or the responses in a secure and productive way. So what are my options? I just discussed kid-safe, kid-friendly office area, designated forensic interview location, safe house, church or home of a traditional or religious leader. I want to throw out there the idea or the concept of a church or home of a traditional or religious leader. Our tribal communities are not all traditional communities. We have so much diversity as far as our faith systems, our churches and so forth, Catholic, Presbyterian, and so forth, that I don't believe that it hurts us, but it only helps us when we're able to reach out to our faith-based services to see how and if they are able to help us enhance our response systems, and also providing a safe space for us to use in these types of events of child abuse and neglect. So the times when will take place are dependent on the following: the incident, age of the child, scheduling, and safety. Now, the age of the child, those of you who have gone through forensic interview training, they do enforce this, is that the age of the child is really important. If you have a child that's maybe 3 and up, and you're going to conduct an interview at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, most likely that's nap time. We need to take all of these considerations, child development and routines, and we have to take those into consideration because of the fact that if we get a sleepy, grumpy child on our hands, most often the responses are not going to be what we would like them to be, which is informed responses that they can provide us responses as opposed to having to sit there and think about it because they're tired or even hungry. So those things are important to remember. And then also the scheduling. Couple of lessons learned on my part is that, if it's a case where we are looking at a child neglect report or child abuse where the child hasn't suffered great bodily harm. Thinking about the child's schedule, thinking about events that are occurring in the community that day, or, all of these things that often play a part in how we do things or how we work in the community, that they're important considerations. Because I've had children in my office that are more worried about, they wanted to go on a class field trip, you disrupted a class activity. Those are things that we as providers should look at supporting them in, but also ensuring that we get the information we need in a timely manner. So it's really a matter of balance between you and whoever you're working with in scheduling an interview. How many interviews that take place are dependent on the following. So you have the bullet points there. It's all going to depend on how much information you need, who you need it from, and how much information you can collect per interview. One of the things that I do is I suggest up front with everyone that although we might have one forensic interview, and that would be ideal, but to just prepare them that, we may have up to 2 interviews, because there's nothing worse than getting a response from a child who's old enough to understand what the process is, or a parent or caregiver to say, gee, is there something wrong? What happened? We need, So, being able to over-project and determining this and communicating it with the victim or the family is really important. How long? This is always going to depend on the age of the child, the demeanor of the child, and the complexity of the situation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that complexity issue in upcoming slides. Other considerations for your interview strategies are the cultural considerations. Child and family identification. Who are they? What is their family practice? What is their standing in the community, if any? I know we have a couple of folks on the line from Navajo Nation, and that is a large reservation. And with the chapters and the various judicial districts, sometimes people know each other, or they might have a standing in the community, and those things, we need to be mindful of. At Choctaw in Oklahoma, same thing, large area, various communities. And I'm sure that that's throughout the country with our nations, our Indian nations. But also perception of community agency. I've heard very many and various occasions where oftentimes people perceive social services as a takeaway agency. They take kids away. Law enforcement is the bah humbug of the community. People, when they see law enforcement or they see a service agency car at someone's home or place of work, everybody always jumps to the conclusion that they did something bad. And sometimes that perpetuates how families or how individuals look at agencies. And I think that understanding those perceptions are really important in order for us to be effective with families. Experience with community agencies, being able to ask or find out if you're working with a certain family, maybe find out what their experience with community agencies have been. Has it been good or bad? And we'll talk about how to pull those questions out as we go through a few of the questions in the interview strategies questionnaire. Also, clarity on language and meaning. If there are language barriers or anything of that nature, then we need to be able to understand those things and how we can best address those as providers. Other cultural considerations or cultural values and principles. I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but this is where we really, I think, have a lot of controversy, or we have some really spirited debates, is what I'll say, amongst my colleagues in and around New Mexico and beyond, is that because you're a degreed social worker, you're a degreed behavioral health person, you're a degreed educator, does not mean that you're by far the expert in how these interviews should be conducted. The cultural or an understanding of that particular cultural or community's cultural values and principles is really important to understand. And being a doctor of education, I know that looking at textbooks that we teach a more broad-based approach to cultural competency. So it's really important to really hone into what that specific community's culture is. You know, what are the values of it? What are the core values of that community? Also understanding child development and responses. I've had cases here where I'm at where young children have had a sore mouth or a red mouth because they had chili put in their mouth. And some of our non-native social workers or responders immediately, called that into as a child abuse issue, not understanding that part of the culture or the old teachings was that whenever a child was saying naughty words or red words, as my kids would say, that was the punishment. They put maybe a chili pepper or something on their mouth. So, it's important to understand things like that, how the community responds to those types of issues, and also understanding parenting views and practice, what they perceive to be child abuse and neglect, and understand the stressors and responses that they have to those stressors. So I believe that those are all part of the cultural considerations. Interview structures. Here's a couple of common visuals whenever you think of or are conducting interviews. The face-to-face, which I always advocate for with families. No desk, no barriers between me and the parents or guardians that I work with or adolescents. I want to be able to present that I am fully engaged with my clients, that I'm trying to get the information and understand that information. And it also, I think, really puts clients at ease. When you're calling people into the office, being able to remove the physical barriers between you and them and have a conversation where, you're going to document notes here and there, but it really works at putting people's mind at ease. That what we're doing is we're going to establish an interview, but in a conversational way. With children, it varies. It really does. It depends on the child's age, what type of environment that we're conducting the interviews. Those types of considerations are really important in determining how much information you'll get and the comfort level of the respondent or the child. So eco statements and responses. Examine communication and order. And what I mean by that, and it's something that you all, I'm sure, do quite frequently, is examining behaviors, examining the tone, examining gestures of respondents when you're trying to collect information. How they communicate. Is it more, gesturing? Is it verbal? Is it, how are they communicating with you on every level? And then in what order? Sometimes when I've conducted an interview, some things that will happen is that the respondents, especially families and caregivers will be more interested on the outcome of the interview as opposed to starting off the interview with the basic questions. And I always take that into consideration because if my families or caregivers start off by wanting to know what's going to happen after this, what are you going to do, who does this information go to, are you going to take the kids away, or those types of questions, then it directs me in a different strategy or to a different strategy with that family, is by asking, instead of, okay, we got this report, what I generally do is say, okay, so what are your concerns today before we start off? What are your concerns, and what can I do to help you with that? Because the order of the information that you need, if it's not aligned with how they approach the conversation, then obviously you need to help decrease those anxieties in such a way that they feel comfortable in answering your questions. And that's also a part of being very considerate, or that cultural considerations piece is being able to work with them in that manner. So a couple of things. We have different forms of violence. Children exposed to family violence and children that are abused and neglected. And those are the interview strategies and the questions that I prepared for everyone today. So child interviews involving exposure to family violence. Things that we want to look at are the patterns of abuse, impact of violence, child safety, and the child's knowledge, overall knowledge about the issue. And some notations here is that the following questions in an interview are talking points. And these are not intended to be used alone, but the questions or the example of questions that I provide in the upcoming slides are really for considerations to enhance the interview process or the strategy. So I'm going to start with this slide right here. It is very, very important when initially working with a child, regardless of any age, is to have them articulate for you their perception of family and relation. And an example I have is that for some of us for me growing up, where I have my great aunts are really not what I call my aunts or my great aunts. They're called my grandma, or my great uncles are really my grandpas. And that's how we've been taught to respond to family members. And our God brothers and sisters might be just our brothers and sisters. So it's really important to find out the child's perception of the family and the relations. Because as you go on, and if you're trying to find out maybe someone who hurt them and the suspect is a brother or sister, it's important to be very clear about those relations, because on a couple of occasions, we've actually had a brother being accused of something when it was actually a first cousin who was called brother. So it's important, because as tribal communities, tribal systems, some of us have been raised that way, so our perception of family and relations are not always aligned with Western ways of family. Aunts, uncles, great aunts, great uncles, great grandmas, and stuff like that. Some of us have used just the straight grandma, grandpa type thing. Melissa, do we have any questions?
Yes. Previously, you had mentioned that PL280 States, which is Public Law 280. For those who are maybe not necessarily familiar with that or live in a state that is PL280, could you briefly explain that? I know that it definitely could be another webinar itself, but maybe just to give folks a little bit more background.
Sure. So our PL280 states, which actually they're called Public Law 83-280 states, have those, and within those states, there's a transfer of legal authority or jurisdiction from the federal government to states as it relates to tribal governments. So you might have a tribal community in the state of California, but they don't have that BIA federal system that they have responding to issues or, potential federal crimes on the reservations. With those PL280 states, you'd have the state law enforcement that would come in and work with the tribe or the community, and they have jurisdiction. The PL280 states, some things to know with them and is that they have, they've been able to bring about an increased role for state criminal jurisdictions or criminal justice systems in Indian country. There's basically an elimination of federal criminal justice roles, as I mentioned, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and FBI for those of us in non-PL280 states. And things that have occurred or that can occur, I can't say what the current state of the PL280 system is and how effective it is in responding to abuse in Indian country. But several years ago, it's been perceived to be more of an obstacle than it is as any help to tribal communities because they don't have that tribal control, that local control over crime in their community. Other issues that come about with that is an increase in probably an increased amount of confusion on the state's role in civil-related matters. So the jurisdiction as it relates to criminal issues with most tribal governments that I've worked with in Oregon and in California and in Wisconsin is that, or Alaska is that, well, all of these things are happening at a criminal level with us, and the state troopers or the village, the state troopers are supposed to be responding to things in the village, and that's been a little bit of frustration for these tribal communities because they don't get the same response, or I would even say the cultural consideration in response time and approaches to the people as you might otherwise see in other jurisdictions or other states that are non-PL280.
Thanks, Melissa, for further explaining that. You can go on to your next slide.
So understand relationships. As I mentioned, Native people's reference to family, friends, and communities is sometimes very different. Also, we have clan systems. There are some tribes that, or probably a lot of them, that still use the clan system. So, understanding that from a child's perspective about family and kinship is important as well. Why interview? What are we looking for? So when what we're doing, once we've done that assessment and everything, and we're getting ready to facilitate an interview, what do we ask? And these are just some examples, can you tell me what you might see if parents or other adults fight? And there are some specific questions that I was trained to ask, and the questions, especially aligned with this first one, is what do you see when parents or adults fight or other adults fight? Instead of asking a respondent, can you tell me what you might see if parents or other adults fight? The way that the questions are received and the way that they're developed is just as important as when we ask them. Because if we consider that we have different learning styles, we have different ways of how we see things and transmit them in our head, these types of questions are intended to capture that, to stimulate someone who might be more of a visual learner. They learn from seeing things. They see things and they interpret it. So I try to use this as often as I can, as starting off with, can you tell me what you might see? Can you tell me what you might hear when parents or other adults fight? Because not all of our children who are exposed to domestic violence or family violence will see things, but they might hear things. And those are the things that we want to really pull out from an interview when we're investigating. Other questions. Can you tell me what you might do if one parent or adult gets mad? And this is really intended to elicit not only what they've seen and heard now, but what their responses are. How do they handle this type of situation? And then going on to how they feel and who they might talk to. And this final question has really served me well when working with families where there is family violence occurring. Because if a child or a sibling group says, well, I talked to the bus driver, or I talked to the secretary at the school, or the neighbor, then that gives me an opportunity to really pull out a separate list of potential interviewees for my case. So if some child or sibling group says that the school secretary knows something about this, then I can go back and maybe ask for some time to talk with her or him and see what they know and maybe anything that they've documented that would help me in serving or responding to this case. So those are just some purposes that I have for the question. What do we ask on the impact of violence? Have you ever seen or heard anyone be hurt because of fighting? Have you seen your mom or dad afraid? Why were they afraid? And in this type of question, what it does is these types of questions eliminate them from making a statement where there are assumptions, but it also helps me clarify how they interpret being afraid. And then their final question about police. Child protection, these are examples too. Where do you go if you see or hear a fight? Do you try and stop a fight? Do you know how to get help during the fight? So these questions are really leading up to not only what I mentioned at the beginning, which is the child's knowledge, but also what they do to protect themselves or their siblings. Okay, and then this just follows on what I just mentioned earlier. So when you have questions regarding child abuse and neglect, standard protocol, whether it's something that you have in place already or it is a part of your forensic interview training, these are basically the questions aligned with what you'll be asking: what happened, when, who was there, and then what do we assess? Child's current physical and emotional condition. What do we ask? So these are just some ideas or questions, and that I would suggest or urge or maybe ask you to consider on how you're framing these questions to try when you're trying to pull out incidents of abuse and neglect from a child. Who else might know or has seen such and such happening to you, or that type of thing? Do you feel okay to continue trying to answer my questions? Oftentimes, with forensic interview training, they ask for you to observe the child to assess whether they can continue on. And the observation might be whether they become fidgety, whether they shut down, they quit talking, or they just ask to go. But it's always important to ask them straight out, do you feel okay to continue with trying to answer my questions? That's one of the things I think that we oftentimes don't really think about when we're interviewing children, is how they feel about the process. Or asking questions, have you ever felt safe at home, school, someone else's home, etc. So in your strength of questions handout, some of these questions that you see here on the slide are starting to align with what we're talking about right now, which is what do we ask? Additional questions aside from your standard questions might be, do you ever get sick? What happens when you get sick, and where do you go? In cases of physical abuse or child neglect, it's important to get these questions out from children, regardless of any age, because if they get sick quite often from earaches, stomach aches, headaches, those types of things, then we're looking at a pattern of, of either a health issue or maybe the home doesn't have adequate resources for heat, or, it could be several other things. It depends on what we're looking for or what brings us to the interview process, neglect, whatever. And then where do you go? It's interesting because sometimes whenever I've interviewed a parent or caregiver regarding their child's health, they say, yeah, we go to the doctor like once every 6 months, and I get my kids' physicals. But then you might talk to the child, and they might say, well, we go to the doctor like every 2 months, or we maybe haven't gone in a year. So you're trying to really ask the child questions and align those responses with what you're getting from the adult. And all of your releases of information as it relates to getting medical records or talking to a provider will help you determine what you've received from the child and what you've received from the adult. Question of, do you have friends at school? Yes, no, and then the other information that you'd get from that. In any type of abuse and neglect case, oftentimes the forensic interview process will be, well, what school do you go to? Oh, how do you like school? What's your teacher's name? And that type of thing. But if you're able to really get more in depth or try to tease out more questions regarding school, then you look at the possibility of other interviewees or the child's perception of how they are situated at school, especially if they're prone to bullying or if there have been events of bullying or truancy or that type of thing. Asking a child their routine, their daily routine, is something that I practice. If I'm interviewing a young child who's been reported for truancy, I want to know what their schedule is. Do they go to bed at 8? Maybe mom or dad says they go to bed at 8 o'clock and then they get up at 6, and the truancy is really because the child is sick. But if the child describes a routine to me that is very different from what the parent does then or says, then those are questions that I probably need to explore further with not only the family but also the school. What do we ask regarding who lives at your house? The difference between the first and second question in interviewing families is that children's perceptions, once again, who lives at your house, who comes to your house and stays there for more than a day and night. A child sometimes will say, well, my mom and my dad and my brother and sister live at the house, But when you say who comes to your house and stays there for more than a day or night, you might find that auntie or uncle or another, maybe a god brother or sister stays there 2 weeks out of the month. And they might, and if it's an abuse case, then they might have knowledge to what's going on in the home, or they might even be the suspected perpetrator. So it's really important to distinguish these things with children. Oftentimes I see with standard interview sheets and protocols is that there's not that differentiation so that the child says, oh, only these people live in the home. But when you ask about coming to stay, they view that differently. And then also asking who takes care of them whenever mom can't or mom needs to go somewhere. So this question right here, what does your mom caregiver do if there's a problem at home? This is really an opportunity to get the child's perspective on how the parent handles stress, how they respond to certain things that go on in the home. And it also gives the child, you, the opportunity to hear from the child what they determine or consider a problem. Maybe paying the utilities. It might be getting transportation, getting to work or not having a job, those types of things. So if the child is able to convey that through the interview, then as the social worker or even the investigator, the law enforcement person, you probably get a better understanding about how what's going on with this case, and probably start thinking a little ahead of time about what a treatment plan would look like. So here we have the interviews with families. Of course, every interview with families, not specifically the child, but with the family, is always going to depend on what's going on with the family, what leads us up to this point in time for an interview. Strategies will always be different, and they should be different. Programs should always assess or consider who is best able to work with a child or family. And the reason why I put this out there and I ask for people to think about it very long and hard, is that some of our, even though we might be limited on staff and we might only have 2 workers or 4 workers, at one time I was the only worker for a year and a half here, sometimes maybe my forte is working with abused elders or, working with disabled people. That might be, someone's forte as opposed to, someone who's very good with children, somebody who's able to really build rapport right away with a family and that type of thing. So, assessment investigation approaches are really important to understand when it comes to looking at who's able to best work with the family and get the information we need to help them. So I want to go into the mapping concept. Some of you who have ever been involved in a strategic plan or, some type of community plan, you might have already heard this about community mapping. But I want to take that concept and apply it to what we're talking about right now. So community mapping, especially for tribal communities, I find is so important because not only does it provide us visual aid to what's happening, but it identifies areas of risk, or like the housing areas that that are more at risk. It helps you nail down characteristics of that area and where you might need to go do more outreach and awareness. Why this is important is if you live possibly on a reservation or, another tribal community, or or even an urban community, and you have X amount of calls that, you know, are coming possibly from one area of the community, this type of mapping helps you go or to further understand, okay, we've had 10 calls come from here in the last 2 weeks versus another area. So what you would want to do in this type of mapping is you'd want to be able to look at what the similarities are in those calls as well as the differences, and try to plot them, because if there is a high number of child abuse, neglect calls or family violence calls in one housing area or one area of the community, if that area doesn't have street lights, or maybe law enforcement says, you know what, we've had a lot of gang activity in there, or we've had a couple of families in that area that have been kicked out from the housing program, then that might give you as a provider, and I'm speaking to the social workers and other family service workers, it gives you an idea that maybe you need to collaborate with another agency like housing, maybe your roads department, or another agency that can respond to what you're seeing. So this is really important as well whenever you're looking at outreach and awareness of child abuse and family violence issues, is that once you put it on a map of maybe where things have happened maybe in the last 6 months, the numbers and the types of cases and what happened with those cases, believe me, you will have a much better understanding of who's more at risk versus those areas of the reservation that are doing well. I'm not saying that every reservation is going to show one big blue plot in one particular area. You might have some straggling identifiers within your map, but you know, those are areas that you can respond to in whatever way you feel you need to. But those areas where you might have within a 1 mile or 2 mile radius where you have a high number of calls, you know, that allows you to take a more proactive approach in how you're going to handle things with that particular part of the community. So specific considerations for your interviewing strategies is family history, their current situation, language, culture, and current and past systems of care that have been provided to the children and their families. Another practice that I use during my intake process is I have folks come in and we do the interview, but another thing that I have them do as homework is develop for me a family tree. You know, starting with their mother, their grandparents, their siblings, nieces and nephews. That might sound like, you know, like it's too time-consuming, or it might appear to be something that's not critical at that point in time. But what this helps me do is it helps me look back at the history of the family. If Grandma and Grandpa were involved in the system 15, 20 years ago, and maybe other siblings are involved in the system now, or, you know, nieces and nephews, then what happens is that you start looking at a pattern within not just the immediate family, but also the extended family. So not saying that you're going to label the family and stigmatize the whole group of them, but it gives you an idea to really go back and see, okay, how are we working with this family? What are things that we haven't done? You know, what might be some contributing factors to why they keep coming into the system? And that goes back into the perception of how the family views systems or social services or whatever. It goes into maybe their historical relationship with the tribal government itself and other programs. It helps give you a bigger and better picture of this family from maybe 1, 2, 3 generations about how they've been involved and what have the outcomes been for them. It gives you a strategy or a potential idea for a strategy to use with them, especially if there's a history of violence and all that other stuff, abuse and neglect. So current situation, assess the initial report. But before I go on to that, for those of you that were able to download the strength of questions or the interviewing strategies, that strength of questions, just real briefly, on the first page you have medical and assistive devices. And the questions that I ask in relation to that is really overall intended to figure out if there's some medical needs, if there are some things that, if a parent or a caregiver says, yeah, I'm supposed to be wearing a hearing aid, but I don't, or I can't afford it, or I lost it, or that type of thing, then I know from the offset that I need to speak up and I need to be clear in my tone of voice with them. I need to be able to ask them on occasion, is that clear? Did you hear what I said? That type of thing, especially if they're quiet and you're trying to interact with them. So those are reasons why I ask these questions. Disability, educational issues. If I have a parent who had a bad experience in school, if they were bullied themselves, then that might be a reason why the parent either doesn't take the bullying situation with their kids seriously, or that might be a reason why they're overprotective and maybe not wanting them to go to school. For drugs and alcohol, if you get the history from them and you find out that they lived in an environment where there was drugs and alcohol when they were growing up, that might be able to explain some of the passive responses to the importance of not having drugs and alcohol in the home. If there's gambling issues where, maybe a parent or a caregiver, grandma or grandpa, leaves the kids in the truck while they go and gamble for a couple of hours, and you get that report from the tribal police that says we've got a family or kids out here being unattended. If there's a gambling issue or a potential problem with this allows you to address that on a different level by connecting them with resources. If the other part of this too is like surrounding discipline, especially because our parents, our new parents are becoming younger and younger. Their perception of what responsibility, abuse, and neglect could be extreme, that they're extremely knowledgeable of what their responsibilities are. It may be an extreme on the other side where they're not really aware. It's important to ask them questions to gauge what their knowledge is, especially about laws. Can you explain to me what child abuse is or neglect? Because if child abuse to them is beating a child, but they say, I just spanked my child, well, then that's the opportunity to really educate or inform them about, what all of these things mean, because that's sometimes what brings them to your office. Also, history of domestic violence and other generational influences. And what I mean by that is that it's helpful at times to understand where if the parents or caregivers you're working with came from a broken home, or whether they came from a family where the parents are married and so forth. The reason is that sometimes when clients have come from broken homes and I'm working with them, there's a couple of dynamics that I've seen is that the mother or father is very willing to engage in relationships. You know, they bring someone to live with them. They fully emotionally invested in these other adults in this relationship, neglectful of what the child's needs are. So then you have maybe custody issues. You might have lack of communication with the other parent, which sometimes leads to false reports that come in where one parent accuses the other of abuse or neglect just for the sake of a custody fight. So those are reasons behind some of the questions that I ask. Transportation, I think, is pretty straightforward. You know, if you're anticipating in your treatment plan that parent, caregiver, or child is supposed to go to therapy and there's no transportation that runs after 4 o'clock or it costs money, then you know that you're going to have to make accommodations or help them to achieve have a successful outcome with their plan. So avoiding all of these prejudgment about what's going on with the family. You're assessing, you're getting information, but you're not basing the outcome of the case meaning like somebody's guilty, you know, somebody's neglectful, they're doing all these things, I just know it. If the interview responses lead you to something that's different from the family history, then that's what it's supposed to do. I try to help other participants or communities understand that, you know, just because someone comes from a family in the community that people might have stigmatized or they might have labeled as the no-good bunch of people in that family, doesn't necessarily mean that that the group that the family you're working with is exactly the same. That's why it's important to get the information and have a good interview strategy to kind of get them to give you the responses that are necessary to help you get out of the system, help them get out of the system. But it's not an approach to case planning after you've done your investigation and stuff where you're enabling the family. You're just helping them come to realize or to deal with things that maybe they've neglected or avoided about their own upbringing as it relates to family. So we have right now on my screen, I have a time period. We said we were going to do 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and go through a couple of areas, which is motivational interviewing as a tool. Why? You know, motivational interviewing is, as it states here, increases the likelihood of engagement from interviewees. If you take the opportunity to ask them those things that are more positive, or to ask them where they are as it relates to, you know, determining whether they are ready to make changes or not, that approach is better than saying you guys will make this change or you will have this reconciled in the next 6 months. If people are not ready to change, they're not going to change, and that's going to make you more angry, and then that's going to make them unsuccessful in the treatment plan process. Of course, I have families that I've worked with that are very savvy in knowing the process where they go through all of the treatment plan, they do it well, they get all their certificates at the end, but then we might find them 6 months down the road. And that's because some of them will do what's necessary to get out of their situation, and they don't have their whole heart and mind in it. So some principles for the motivational interviewing. I have them listed here. So we're going to go to poll question number 4. Do you believe that standard forensic interviewing techniques, that question went away really fast. So if you could answer that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so I can just repeat it. Do you believe that standard forensic interviewing techniques provide the same information, whether Native, Alaskan Native groups, or other ethnicities? And looks like about, we'll say 80% of respondents are saying no.
All right. Well, thank you all for your responses to that question. So I'm going to go to final considerations, which is understanding family social systems and tribal communities or populations. So critical to positive outcomes in cases. Understanding and addressing community agency perception. If you're in a agency where a lot of people don't really like your agency for whatever reason, I know it's hard, and I know we're not in the business of trying to please everybody, but I think even the littlest of things are helpful, either by increased community engagement, maybe, participating in community events that support the family. I think there's several different ways that we can help enhance the perception of our work and our agencies in the community. Also applying eclectic approaches. For those of you that are trained or educated, degreed in certain approaches to working with at-risk families or victims of abuse, that standard technique or process it's important to be able to be flexible. But flexibility is really based on our judgment and our understanding of the community. Also understanding historical and present-day community events, whether it's history of, maybe there's a boarding school in your community, or maybe there is the BIA and there's a lot of resistance from the community in responding to BIA law enforcement. There could be several things, but it's important to understand at least try to understand maybe the last 20 to 50 years, because what that does is that allows you to see what growth has occurred and where things have not changed or maybe things have gotten worse. So basically, in conclusion, the strategies with Native Americans, I can't say enough that the strategy needs to be not aligned with what I would call a cultural blindness approach, where you think everybody's the same. There's so many things that impact families' perceptions of what we do and what child abuse and neglect is, and all these other laws and systems that we have in place. But it's important for us to understand the environment and all these systems and how these families have been involved or respond to them. So most or all of our helping training skills are based on textbook and contemporary practices and not always reflective of different cultural groups. And, we have 560 plus tribes in the United States, and our ways of knowing and our ways of existence are all different. Just because I'm a Chiricahua Apache doesn't mean that I can go into Navajo Nation and say that I'm fully competent to work in their community, because their way of life, their way of doing things, their history is different from mine. So I think oftentimes that's a misunderstanding or or a misapproach that is used is that just because we're Native, we can go into someplace else and do what we do. So a couple of questions that I have here are people trained in the ADA before they risk medical judgment during assessment? So good question. What we're doing is we're not doing any type of, we're trying to figure out where our challenges might be with an interviewee, with an adult caregiver. Because, as I mentioned, if someone says that, you know, they think that they might have an emotional challenge, you know, they might be depressed or something of that nature, then that's an opportunity to collaborate with another agency or send a referral with the client to help them get help or for them to reestablish services. So you're not really doing anything more that's going to jeopardize or to put you at risk for a tort claim. If you're a 93-638 program where you receive your funds from IHS or Indian Health Services, I always tell people you got to be cautious. You got to be very cautious because you are liable and can have a tort claim by a community member if you try to diagnose someone and you don't have the skills to do that, and then something happens, something tragic happens, or if you fail to act, and that's where that cross-reporting is important. If you fail to act and communicate and collaborate with other agencies and something happens, you're liable for that situation. And a lot of families may or may not know that. You know, some of them are getting more savvy these days, but it's really important. So the questions that regarding health and disabilities are not intended to make a judgment, but more to inform you. The other question I have here is, if you're in Phoenix, Arizona, would I be able to obtain forensic interview training? If you go onto that National Children's Alliance website, you would be able to find agencies that could provide that to you, or just Google forensic interview training Arizona, and I'm sure folks would pop up, or organizations. But the important thing on determining a credible agency is looking to see if they are a member of the National Children's Alliance, or they're vetted by another organization regarding forensic interview training. The reason is that we have a lot of consultants, we have a lot of agencies around the country who provide forensic interview training, but they can't certify you. They can't certify you. And the reason why this is important is that if you are in the line of work and you're doing a forensic interview training, and something goes wrong, something happens to that child, or I mean, it could be a number of things, and you are not vetted by that agency through certification, then, you know, that's a hazard for you. Next question, how do you proceed to interview a child who has a communication disorder? Good question. For example, a 9-year-old who functions at an 18-month-old level. Well, those types of situations are really hard to get around. But something that a practice of mine, as a matter of fact, I have a couple of fetal alcohol cases where the child is the victim, is being able to work with their primary care provider, as well as the special education or the school folks that they work with, to help develop a strategy for communicating with them. If there's a visual impairment, obviously we would work on ways to respond to that. Or if there's a hearing disability, you know, we would also work with those areas. But it's really going to require that you become very familiar about all of these people that work with that child on a day-to-day basis in order to develop a strategy and approach and determine who's best to help you. If it's physical abuse, then you could use the medical exam. If it's sexual abuse, the same thing. But if it's neglect, you might be able to also use a physician. But I think pulling together your resources and helping those providers also be able to provide you any concerns that they've had over that child. The next question, why would you avoid the previous family history? You're going to get the family history through the questions that, it's up to everyone whether they want to do the supplemental questions. But you don't want to stigmatize a family even more or stigmatize them at all if you're basing your case plan and your approach based on something that their parents did or other family members did that are maybe similar to what's happening with this family. And that's an ethics, that's an ethical issue. That's something that you wouldn't do. But it's important to have the history so that you can help find maybe a new strategy, a better strategy on working with this current situation in the family so that you don't overstep your boundaries. So that's all. It's 1:30. My time is up, and I really appreciate everyone's participation today, and I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, for your presentation and for responding to our audience's questions. For those who are interested in viewing Melissa's last webinar, Indicators for At-Risk Native American Children, and to register for her next webinar on May 19th entitled Outreach, Prevention, and Intervention Strategies in Tribal Communities, a Focus on Child Safety, please visit OJJDP's online university or at the Amber Alert website provided in your handout. So before we close, I'd like to thank you for participating in today's webinar and give a special thanks to Melissa for joining us. And lastly, I'll turn the presentation back to Janine from NTTAC. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. If you could take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey, that would be great. This webinar will be archived on OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. For more information, please contact OJJDP, NTTAC, or Fox Valley. Again, here's the feedback survey link, and thank you again for joining us today.